Story 1. Started English as a 6-year-old coming to Australia from Italy. But even now, some simple everyday monologue is in Italian, for example, "What lovely tomatoes." I'm 77. You never forget. The big deal thoughts are in English. Story 2. When you are truly fluent in a language, you also think in that language. And if you are fluent in more languages, you switch between languages without realizing it most of the time. Story 3. Native fluent in Frisian and Dutch and fluent in English. When I am in the United Kingdom, my brain is in English mode, which results in having to shift gears when speaking to someone in Dutch or Frisian. I even dream in English now, which took about 5 years since moving to the United Kingdom. When I am in the Netherlands or, oddly, elsewhere abroad, I tend to be in Dutch mode, but if it involves my relatives, it is always Frisian, and I can switch between those two instantly without thinking. One of the things I find interesting about that is that despite English now being the language I have spoken more than either Dutch or Frisian for at least 18 years, I still have not got that fluid switch. I did try and find out a bit more about that, but it is different for different people. For me, I would suggest that deep down my engine is still wired in Dutch and Frisian, and there is an actual translation layer at work for English. Story 4. Funny stuff. Sometimes I have problems finding the correct word in my own language, but know exactly what it is in English. Story 5. I do not think in a language unless I force myself to, for instance, to practice a speech, but this slows me down a lot and it is an effort. I also do not see or hear things. This is like that both during conscious thoughts, daydreams, and dreams. The thoughts just happen. It is like ideas or concepts flashing in rapid succession, but without any visuals, sound, or other representation. Just abstract thoughts. My brain works on the conceptual level. Story 6. That sounds like a natural result of being immersed in both languages. It is interesting how your brain switches between them depending on the context. Does it ever feel confusing, or do you just go with the flow? Story 7. My inner monologue is both in German and English at the same time. It only makes sense in my head. Dreams are mostly in the language I'd been speaking during the day. Story 8. My English teacher in high school gave me advice that if you want to learn another language but you can't go to a country where they speak this language, you have to force yourself to think in this language. It became my habit to the point that I usually think in English or German even when I'm in Poland. My inner monologue now has a British accent. Story 9. My native language is English, but Mandarin has been my main language since I learned it when I was 18. My inner dialogue is usually in Mandarin unless I'm reading or speaking English. Story 10. For me, it really depends on what I am thinking about and what language I have been using before it. Usually, university stuff is in English, family is in my native language, and with friends, it is either English or Dutch. But if I used another language before, it can differ. Sometimes it is even a mixture of them. Story 11. That's an interesting dynamic between languages. It must be fascinating to experience that shift when you are back in Germany. How do you feel about it? Does it ever feel like a challenge to switch between the two? Story 12. My brain thinks in whichever language I'm talking for 4 languages, but my inner monologue is in one of 2 languages if I'm not talking. It depends on context. I speak a different language at home than at work. I have basic proficiency in a few other languages, but then I still think in my native or my second language. Story 13. When alone and left to my own devices, I mostly think or monologue in my mother tongue, but will occasionally do so in my second language. If I am actively communicating in the second language, then my brain is much more in that mode and less in native language mode. Story 14. I speak 3 languages fluently and 1 intermediately. While English is not my mother tongue, it is the language I have spoken the most, so my inner monologue runs in English. But when I am cussing someone out in my head, it is in my mother tongue, because the cuss words just hit differently. Story 15. I speak 3 languages. For me, it depends on what language I've been using the most in the past few days. I use the same language for thinking and inner monologue. My dreams are almost entirely in my mother tongue, though. Story 16. I hardly ever speak English since I don't need it for work and there are few tourists where I live, but most of what I do outside of work I do in English, mainly digital entertainment. Whenever I'm immersed in my thoughts, They are in English, not because it's my default thinking language, but because I find it easier to explore concepts with it rather than Italian. A significant part of this is how easy it is to use words outside of their initial meaning, such as using nouns as verbs. A fitting example would be adulting, even if I hate that term, which helps make a broad or vague concept quite immediate and familiar to grasp without the need for a detailed explanation. Word plays are also hilarious, and English, with its phrasal verbs and some grammatical flexibility, allows for many options that we simply don't have. Story 17. I speak 5 languages, and my inner monologue is still English. Sometimes, when speaking another language, I mix up my translations with other languages and have to correct myself. Story 18. I think in Swedish mostly. But since I spend a lot of time online for work and can casually scroll Reddit and such during work hours like right now, I spend a lot of time thinking in English as well. Reading and writing in English essentially puts my brain in English mode. And I think in English then. So basically, Swedish for day-to-day, but I feel like my brain switches to English as soon as I'm online. Story 19. I speak 2 languages fluently. English for my mom and German for my dad. Usually, it is pretty interchangeable, but I count things in English and calculate in German. So there is that. I prefer to read English. Story 20. Both. Some things can be expressed better in one language than the other. And sometimes none will be enough. You can't get so much out of human language. Story 21. Earlier, it used to be my mother tongue, but as I have been speaking in fluent English for the past 15 years, it has been a mixture of both. Recently, I moved to another country, and I mainly use English as a primary language while still learning Dutch, so currently I think I'm English. Story 22. Before speaking, you are always rehearsing in your head what you are going to say, and that is in the language you are going to speak. You do this even in your own language, whether you are aware of it or not. Switching between languages disrupts this, of course. For me, the transition is quite slow, but you think in the other language when you are speaking that language. Personally, my inner voice switches between my own language and the other language all the time. Story 23. Sometimes I am thinking in my second language, get stuck on a word, and then stop and think, why am I thinking in that language? It's inefficient. It's good practice, though. Story 24. I speak 5 languages. I don't think in my mother tongue and translate to the other language. Rather, I think in the language I'm speaking. It just switches naturally. Story 25. Depends. Right now I'm reading stuff on Reddit in English, so I'm thinking in English. When I talk to my friends in Italian, I mostly think in Italian. When I'm not doing anything language specific, I'd say it's about 50-50, but I prefer English. For context, my native language is Italian. Story 26. I am a native German speaker but fluent in English. I live in Germany and use English only with specific friends or online. Most of my thoughts are either in German or a mix of both languages, as I often switch when I cannot think of the right word in one language and substitute it with the other. However, the language of my thoughts can shift depending on the context. For example, when I am with someone I usually speak English with, my thoughts naturally switch to English. Similarly, when I think about content I enjoy, my thoughts are predominantly in English too, probably because most of the content is in English. Interestingly, when I am angry, in an argument, or upset, I tend to swear in English almost instinctively. Story 27. Generally, my first language is used when I'm alone, but I often talk to myself mentally in my second language during the day when I'm around others who only speak my second language. Story 28. I speak Hungarian and English. Since I am not living in Hungary anymore and I use English daily, I think in English for the most part. I do think in Hungarian still, but not as often. But one thing my brain does not change to English is counting. I only count in my mother language, and I cannot change that unless I force myself or if it is just counting to 5 or some small number. Story 29. I have an inner monologue. I speak 3 languages fluently or natively, and a 4th one is hanging in there for dear life. My inner monologue happens in whatever language I would use in that situation. Am I thinking of work-related stuff and I speak a specific language at work? Then my monologue is in that language. Am I thinking about what I am bringing for lunch with my family and I speak another language with them? then my monologue is in that language. But maybe this happens because something very specific happens with me that I'm not aware is a general thing with polyglots. If I start speaking a language with you, I will continue with that and will feel weird to speak to you in another language even if we both understand it. So maybe the situation is more pronounced because of my strong association with people. Story 30. I am native English but have been living in Japan for more than half of my life. I spend roughly an equal amount of time drifting between English and Japanese. Story 31. I speak 4 languages. One of them I never think in. The other 3, one is my mother tongue, another is the language of the country I live in, and the other is the one I use at work. Depending on where I am, the moment of the day, or who I am with, I will think in any of these 3, whichever I need in the situation. With my inner monologue, it gets funnier. It just depends on my mood. Sometimes it will even switch in the middle. Story 32. German native but learned English in school. Most of the time I think in German. It's only sometimes that I think in English, mostly after writing or reading a lot in English. Story 33. Depends on the speaker with whom I am speaking and the context. My thoughts and inner monologue will be in that language. When I have to deal with multiple languages at the same time, I tend to translate them all to English. English is not my native tongue, but I learned it at a very young age. For other languages, I learn them using materials for English speakers. Story 34. I may be Italian, but after too much internet, I sometimes switch to English. I also switch when my mind is simulating a discussion, maybe because online life is much richer in arguments than actual life. Story 35. Actually, my brain thinks in the language that is right for the context. If I am online and browsing through mostly English comments, my brain thinks in English. When I speak to my colleagues, I speak and think in Japanese. When I dream I am back home and speak to my dad or my brother, I think in my mother tongue. Interestingly enough, there are very few cases where my brain gets confused by a language switch. Story 36. My boyfriend thinks in English since we live in the United States. When he went to his home country for a week, he started thinking in Spanish, and it kind of freaked him out a bit. As far as I know, he is not able to think in any other language. Not sure if this is related, but he can read English and Spanish in his head. Much to my annoyance, he frequently reads Italian, Hebrew, Latin, and Mandarin out loud. Story 37. Interesting question. Inner monologue in English, second language. Mutter under my breath cursing in Korean. When I need to do multiplication tables, I do it in my head in Korean, primarily schooled there, so committed to memory from repetition. Story 38. I think in both languages and my inner monologue is in both languages. In dreams, it depends on who I'm talking to, as I speak different languages with different people. Story 39. It's not a monologue. It's more of a crowd murmuring in every language, including those I speak partially or miserably. It's just all over the place, and being immersed in them, I never stop to think what language I'm thinking in now. It's on autopilot. Story 40. Only 2 languages here. I feel that it's very normal not to always have the vocabulary to express what you're thinking. I think, and if I intend to communicate it, I will consciously exert the effort into translating my thoughts into words. It's hard to explain, so let me give an example. I take a breath, and the air flows through my nose and down to my diaphragm, but I didn't really think of that in words. I felt it, I felt many aspects of the experience, I understood what just happened, but until I focused on it and gave myself the goal of communicating it, I didn't really have words for it within my mind. Honestly, even as an adult with a decent vocabulary, I still struggle to understand and express every thought and feeling I have, let alone express them accurately in words. Story 41. My inner monologue doesn't really have a language. It's very difficult to explain, but I mostly think in abstract concepts rather than language. If there is language involved, it's my native language unless I'm communicating in English. Story 42. My grandfather once told me when he got to the United States, if he wanted to keep up with people speaking English, he couldn't translate everything in his head. He had to speak their language in his head. Story 43. Interesting thing I learned about myself. English and Filipino are both my mother tongue, and when I do analytical thinking, I do it in English. But when I'm thinking about more emotional matters, it's in Filipino. I guess it's because Filipino expresses emotion with more impact. Tangina bobo amputa hits harder than what a fucking idiot. And English has a lot more objective terms that are not usually translated into Filipino, like regression model or interest rate. Story 44. I speak 3 languages fluently. I am advanced in another and have basic knowledge at a supermarket and restaurant level in 3 others. I think mostly in English as it is the one I speak all day every day. If I am back in my home country or in Italy, I think in Portuguese or Italian. Learning German with basic knowledge of Dutch and Norwegian is frustrating at times because sometimes a word in throat languages comes out and people get confused. When I start dreaming in a new language, it is my sign that I am getting good at it. Story 45. Both, depending on the subject and importance. If I am thinking my random daily thoughts, mostly in English. If I am preparing for something I consider important, mostly in Spanish because I feel like I will sound smarter than in English as I consider my vocabulary pretty simple and average. I speak both languages pretty evenly, I would say, but nothing beats Spanish for me, at least as of right now.